Nephi, his lead mule, was a veteran of many hundreds of bone-sore miles. During periods of recuperation at Alamo Ranch, Richard described Nephi as fat and rollicky. Now, at some campsite between the mouth and the head of the canyon the men were following, and while they were asleep, Nephi broke his hobbles and ambled off. A common enough occurrence, but one Richard found sufficiently interesting to mention in a letter to Talbot Hyde. He tracked the mule and found him. In such a place, in such circumstances, it's probable the broken hobble was responsible for Richard's finding something of greater interest. Richard first glimpsed Kiet Siel as he rounded the turn in a canyon. It came into view suddenly, without warning. Hints of potsherds scattered on the canyon floor. Above him on the left, buried deeply and airily supported on the curved lip of rock 40 feet above the tops of the thick pin oak, a mammoth elliptical cave stared back at Richard like a giant eye fixed immovably and low on the forehead of a red sandstone cliff. Reaching across its shadows, and from corner to corner, was the largest cliff dwelling in Arizona. 3 long tiers of rooms and fallen walls, pale gold in the morning light. Dense undergrowth of oak fanned out under the lower rim of the cave, obstructing approach. Once through this, the cliff dwelling loomed above, nearly half of it built upon deeply undercut and vaulting span of tawny rock. Otherwise, across the cave's opening, the first tier of rooms could be reached by scrambling up a bare stretch of sandstone, tilted an angle of 45 degrees. A massive retaining wall, now badly broken and fallen outward, extended from one side of the cave to the other. At approximately the center was a wide opening bridged by a ponderous log more than 2 feet thick at its butt end and 35 feet long. How such a log had been raised to such a height puzzled Richard and his companions as they climbed to it, using toe holds which had been chipped into the stone by the Anasazi centuries before. On reaching the great tree trunk, its purpose for being there, at least, became clear. Grooves, worn or burned over the log's upper surface, indicated where long ropes of yucca fiber once bit into the wood as the Anasazi hauled up heavy loads of stone and adobe for building their village. In common with all cliff dwellers, the people of Siel had tossed their refuse over the lip of the cave, making a sizable mound of debris 40 feet below and on one avenue of approach. Over this mound, Richard, Al, and Charlie Mason crunched through a mass of broken potsherds, some of it suggestive of the black-on-white pottery they found at Mesa Verde. Most of it, though, later was to be known as polychromith, predominant colors being orange, red, white, and a black that sometimes fired blue, or the gray corrugated ware of cooking pots, liberally blackened with soot. Mixed in with the sherds were layers of gray ash, chunks of charcoal, worn-out sandals, flakes and discarded knobs of stone used in making knives, axes, hammers, and weapons. Also, fragments of animal bones, corn cobs, and squash rinds. This whole conglomerate mass indicating not only a good deal about the eating and living habits of Siel, but the fact that the village had supported a large population over a long number of years. The terraces and small courts of the cliff dwelling itself were also littered with fragments of shattered pots. But it was not Richard who gave the village its name. Siel in Navajo means broken pottery. He called it Longhouse. As he did in some of the other major ruins he discovered, Richard scrawled his initials and surname with fire-blackened stick, R. Wetherill, at the far central rear of the cave. Under it he wrote the date, but this has been crossed out. Near the place where he left his name, some prehistoric artist had painted 3 turkeys on the cave ceiling. The birds are perched gravely, with inscrutable symbolism, on the heads of 3 men. The turkeys are painted in profile. The humans perches in full face view. Had Richard looked for subtleties of form and detail, he would have found none. The faces of the 3 male figures were featureless blanks. Their flat arms dangled straight down from broad square shoulders, their feet spread wide and planted firmly. Close by, but cheerfully unconcerned with the turkeys, Cocopele, the humpback flute player of renowned sexual prowess, was outlined in white paint. His figure is found on cliff and cave walls through the whole San Juan region. For once, the old boy was relaxing, and instead of playing on his pipe in his usually tense, squatting posture, and obviously enjoying it. Stretching out indolently on his back, flute raised to his mouth, this Cocopele had one leg crossed casually over the other knee. For just this once, he didn't seem to care if the girls were listening or not. Slightly smaller than Cliff Palace, Siel possesses qualities that, in the eyes of some, lend it greater charm and interest. The imagination of its builders, for one, who conceived the daring plan of constructing the walls of a teeming village partly on the fragile crown of an arcing span of stone, partly on a buttressed and filled-in tilt of rock, built in a remote place that remains relatively inaccessible. Siel occupies the head of a canyon of running water and lush greens below great walls of perpendicular red sandstone. Finally, it holds a place of preeminent interest because it is the focal center of an Anasazi culture that coexisted with and yet differed from such other major centers of the time as Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. In the 3 or 4 days Richard and his companion worked in Siel on this trip, Richard counted 115 rooms, missing perhaps as many as 40 or 45, buried beyond the immediate reach under fallen debris. 6 of the rooms he found were circular kivas, somewhat similar to the kivas at Mesa Verde, but lacking masonry pilasters for supporting the roof, as well as the stone bench encircling the circumference of the chamber. Elsewhere in Siel, however, he found a number of small rooms, roughly rectangular, which were entered through a doorway and might be considered ordinary living rooms, except that they contained the ceremonial features of a kiva fireplace and stone air deflector between fireplace and doorway. Had Richard had the benefit of greater experience, this circumstance would have appeared more significant, for in just such peculiarities, archaeologists later traced important tribal and regional influences. At Bedatakan in 1909, John Wetherill and Byron Cummings found no circular kivas at all, but rectangular surface rooms with kiva features, an architectural deviation that, among other things, indicates the people of Siel were of different stock and perhaps spoke a different language. Tree ring dating, a nearly exact science introduced after Richard's death, shows that Siel was occupied approximately from 1116 to 1286 AD. There were little or no evidence of the mayhem and massacre Richard found in some of the caves of Cottonwood Wash and Grand Gulch, and even at Snyder's Well. Many of the rooms in Siel that he and Al and Charlie Mason opened up had been deliberately sealed by the departing inhabitants. Unbroken pots and other utensils too heavy to carry away had been left behind. In one room, they found a great pile of corn cobs and broken melon or squash rinds, a sure sign of food edible enough when the departing people cached it. An invasion of the region by raiding enemies cannot be ruled out, but most evidence pointed to an orderly, peaceful, planned withdrawal. Abandonment of the cliff village may have been caused by the Southwest's most severe drought of prehistoric times, between 1276 and 1299. Following his return to Mancos, Richard wrote to Hyde on June 3, 1895, telling how he had spent the early part of the past winter in New Mexico and Utah, and all this year in Arizona at the head of the Rio de Siel. The latter was Richard's name for Chenal Wash, and at this time he made the mistake of believing that the Chenal's main source was Laguna Creek, heading in Siggy Canyon, instead of in Canyon de Siel. Thinking then of the Segui, he added, "I've just returned from there and met with good success." Neglecting to point out he discovered the second largest cliff dwelling in the Southwest, he went on to say, "We dug from one mound burial 400 pieces of pottery, very fine. At least half of it is red polychrome. This is by all odds the finest collection of pottery I've seen. This is the best place to get a collection I ever saw. It requires work, but the results are very satisfactory. The best cliff houses that I've seen are in that country, and not one has been dug into." One house in particular, Siel, containing 115 rooms. 75 are as perfect as though just left. The rooms are clean, roofs all one. Altogether, this is the place to study the subject. The following January, when it appeared the Hyde brothers would have Richard lead an expedition to March Pass area the coming summer, Richard compared the relative difficulties and cost of work in Canyon de Siel and Segui Canyon, advising that from the standpoint of expense, the Segui would prove more costly, but its cliff dwellings would yield better relics for a collection. His own preference for working once more in Siel and its neighboring ruins is expressed in a letter to Talbot Hyde dated January 6, 1896. "I think I wrote you of the ruins of Canyon du Chalet. If not, the cost of getting to and from there will be slightly less than going into the head of the Shell, which was the best place that I had ever yet found to find relics. At least 20 articles will be found per day, per man. For instance, we dug in 4 days last year what it took 20 days to get out. It is 90 miles to Bluff from Mancos, and 80 miles from there to the forks of the Shell in Siggy Canyon. This is hot country, as you well know, but we can work easily and late. Sufficient water can be had as the springs are numerous, but none of them run off very far from their source on account of being swallowed up in the sand. it is safe to say it will take 8 or 9 days to travel to the vicinity. This letter contains one of the few references to Canyon de Siel which had been found in Richard's correspondences. It would indicate he had only slight knowledge of the region. When he visited Canyon de Siel is uncertain. Probably it was in the spring of 1893 when he and his brothers Al and John traveled as far as the Hopi Mesas to gather objects of modern Indian life for Colorado exhibit at the Chicago World's Fair. What became of the collection made in Segi Canyon in the spring of 1895? It is the one major collection Richard made that has not been traced. And I feel like New York City. Get me to the farm.